Hello and welcome to this One Voice for Manufacturing Public Policy webinar. This is our monthly webinar brought to you by NTMA and PMA. On today's webinar, you have me, Caitlin Sickles from the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and you also have Omar Nashashibi from Inside Beltway. If you are new to the webinars, then you should know that PRG here at Bracewell, we do public affairs and strategic communication on behalf of One Voice, PMA and NTMA. And Omar leads the lobbying effort here in DC on behalf of One Voice. We are coming to you from a very rainy and extraordinarily busy month here in DC. Anybody who has taken even a cursory look at the news would know that there is significant activity here in Washington since President Trump has taken office and issued an unprecedented number of executive orders, as well as taken a number of other actions. You can see here on the slide just some of the things that have happened here in DC and most of what we hope to cover on today's webinar. Since you can see the list is so long, you should anticipate that this webinar will go slightly longer than normal. But if you need to jump off, no worries, know that it will be recorded and available online after today's session is over. If you have questions, we have questions too, but we will certainly try to answer yours. You can submit them through the Q&A feature there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use Q&A and not the chat to enter your questions for us. With that in mind, let's jump in and get started. We will be starting with what's happening on Capitol Hill. Omar, take it away. What's the first thing folks need to know?
That we ran out of room on this slide and Trump's been in office for all of 11 days. I think that's the first thing. So,
Perfect.
yes.
Perfect.
No shortage of things to talk about, no question. But let's just start up with the Hill and then we'll move our way over to the agencies. I was on the Hill yesterday, started my day with meetings on China with the House China Committee, talking about permanent normal trade relations status and tariffs, and then making my way through the Ways and Means members on taxes and reconciliation and where they are. But even before we can get to the taxes, the government still hasn't figured out a pathway to fund itself. From what I'm hearing based on yesterday's conversation is we still do not have what we call top line numbers. That means the amount of money that each agency is going to get from, or really how each committee is going to get, which dictates how much each agency and government and department ends up getting on the federal spending side. Congress has not agreed to that yet, meaning how much they're going to spend in each category. That's usually where you need to start, and then you can trickle out and fill that in. With that not finished, that now means that March 14th deadline is going to be quite troublesome. The House only has, and the Senate maybe have 1 or 2 weeks where they're not here between now and then. So they've got plenty of time if they can get at least that top line and some direction going. There is some increased pressure as expected and as in the past from some on the right wing of the Republican Party to just skip this fiscal year in its entirety and just do what we call a continuing resolution on fiscal year 2025, which we're already about 5 months into, and then just shift over to FY 2026, which began on October 1st of last year, or will begin, on October 1st of this year. And as you look at some of those areas where they might end up going, they're still going to have to deal with disaster relief for a number of states. The president was just traveling to a few of them recently and promised additional funding, so you have to expect that's going to add to it. And the big variable is what do they do with the debt ceiling increase? We do know the president wants that off the table. The reason we do not expect a debt ceiling increase to be included in a budget resolution is reconciliation process is because reconciliation will be Republican only, and if they lose 1 or 2 or 3 votes based on the debt ceiling and government spending, the whole thing collapses. In addition, under the procedures in the Senate, you cannot raise the debt ceiling by a fixed number you cannot extend it, delay it by a date under reconciliation. You'd have to put a specific number, which would put Republicans in a tough spot of increasing the ceiling there by trillions, and that's a tough vote to make your members take. So these are things to continue to look at. Government spending, they are still not there yet. To be honest, when we have this next webinar at the end of February, they likely still will not be there yet. The House Budget Reconciliation, this is the one that will determine what happens on taxes and a number of other areas. A quick refresher on what reconciliation is. Reconciliation is a process that allows the U.S. Senate to skip having to go through 60 votes in order to secure cloture to move a bill to the floor in the U.S. Senate. It doesn't have as much consequence in the House other than the instructions that are set up. The key being is that without having to get to 60, you no longer need the opposing party. This is what Democrats did after they lost the special election in Massachusetts on Obamacare. They had to go through the reconciliation process, and that's how they moved that. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under Trump in 2017. Republicans also passed that with no Democrats under reconciliation, and that's what we're going to find ourselves again on the broader border, energy, and tax bill that they're working on. And that will end up being done through what we call the reconciliation instructions that are put out. The reconciliation instructions are developed by the House Budget Committee that tells each committee what they can spend, what they can cut, and what they can raise in terms of revenue. This is important because the options Republicans put forward now could make their way in the final bill that we're dealing with on taxes. So as the House Budget Committee released their different solutions, they looked at state and local tax deductions, one on a straight extension, one on eliminating it in its entirety and the federal cost and lost revenue. So that's what you're seeing here. So one of the proposals is to end the employee retention tax credit. That's something that we knew that Republicans tried to do in the last Congress, along with Democrats as well. Eliminating the ERC would generate $70 to $75 billion in savings over 10 years. This is important because the budget reconciliation cannot significantly increase the budget deficit in order to not violate the Senate rules. All of these are arcane, but we're explaining to you because when this process gets delayed beyond the timeline the Speaker wants in April, this will make a lot more sense of why they have to go through this process. And this gives you some examples of what they're proposing to do, to cut some from the Inflation Reduction Act. Lowering the C corporate rate to 15% would cost the federal government in lost revenue $522 billion over 10 years. So you can read that, the inverse of that, how it would increase the overall debt. And that's where you have to balance it out with spending cuts on the other side. And that's also playing into the previous slide on the fiscal year 2025 and 2026 funding as well. We're about to endorse a letter, sign on to a letter to endorse legislation by the Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and that's going to be over his death tax bill, the estate tax bill, to make that permanent. Also, NTMA and PMA also just endorsed legislation that would extend 199A, that's the small business and the pass-through deduction of 20% on the tax rate as well. So there's a number of different variables. But as you can see, canceling the R&D amortization, which is one of our top priorities, would generate $169 billion in lost revenue over 10 years. So these are the different factors that we have to go and put in there. And then the elimination of tax on tips, which we know is a priority for the president, would lose around $10 billion in revenue each year. And that's why we did want to lead up with some of those processes on the reconciliation and what's being considered, because that document is 50 pages full of bullets such as those is going to be that menu item on which many Republicans in the House at least start to select which provisions they're going to add and remove in this overall bill. That's going to include taxes. And the tax discussions that we had on the Hill yesterday are really twofold. One, how to prevent tax increases on our members, but then also how to play offense and expand some areas of the tax code to foster additional investment here in the United States. One bill we also introduced this week calls for the doubling of Section 179 small business expensing to get you to about $2.3 million in full 100% expensing for all of you small businesses, which is virtually every one of our members. And that's legislation we're hoping to include in a final tax bill. But based on conversations this week and making the rounds in the Senate next Wednesday, they're still far away from this, especially because next week the House Budget Committee was supposed to have that reconciliation menu and the instructions put forward. And based on my conversations yesterday, it does not look like the Budget Committee is going to be prepared likely next week for a final work product, although that could change now that they're back from Mar-a-Lago here over the next couple of days. That's generally where we stand on taxes. As Caitlin said, please do type in any questions that you've got in the Q&A box, and happy to try to answer those there. It is still a little bit fluid on the tax side. We do have a good amount of support for many of the provisions that we have. The bigger question is which ones are made temporary and which are made permanent. And that's really going to come down to how large this overall package is and whether or not they can afford to lose votes. And what we heard yesterday confirmed what we already know. They do not have the votes as of today, which means they're going to have to wait until after April 1st when the special elections are held to replace some of the nominees that the president has put forward. And with that transition, we take a look at the nominee status here from the president and his cabinet. Overall total, he's got 25 members of the cabinet. That includes president, chief of staff, and other advisors and those. But these are these that have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. We have to keep in mind there's roughly 4,000 political appointments that need to be made. No matter who you are, those are not going to be made overnight. Those will take time. Typically, in most instances, it's a 3-year process, 3.5 years to get all 4,000 in, and then you're either out or run for re-election. Roughly 1,300 positions are going to require Senate confirmation. So this is going to take some time. We are starting to hear some of the appointments. There's some folks that we know that are now going in and over to USTR to be chief of staff. We know some folks going into the White House as well. And so that is going to be helpful to have people in some of those places that we know, particularly in taxes over at the Treasury Department, that's taken some old tax hands from around town that really know their way. With that, I'm going to pause and answer one question that just came in. With the repeal of the R&D 5-year amortization rule, that was the score on that previous slide of what that would come out to if they were to repeal that 5-year amortization. And right now, the conversation that we're having is a full repeal of it and making the R&D expensing permanent. So no more capitalization and no more amortization, and then reinstate that full expensing. The concern that we have when it comes down to that budget cost and the impact on the overall economy, not economy, but overall finances, then that might end up being a temporary provision again, as it was made in 2017. But yes, as of now, if there is a tax bill, it will include the elimination of amortization. That I will say definitively. If there are corporate tax provisions, you will not get a tax bill with corporate provisions without including a repeal of that one of the 174 R&D 5-year amortization rule on that one. But as we look at the nominee status, what's critically important, especially as we start discussing some of the trade priorities of the president, we'll note that he delayed for 60 days many of the regulations and rulemakings. He delayed until April 1st many of the recommendations he wants to receive on trade in order to allow for many of these positions to be filled. In that process, when he creates a vacancy, he has to fill it. He created a few more vacancies. President Trump did just this week oust the National Labor Relations Board member and, more importantly, the general counsel. He is legally permitted under his authority to remove, in some cases, the general counsel, but removing that board member, that is precedent setting, one that has not happened before. There are certain instances that are prescribed by law in which you can remove. There's actually only 3 instances in which you can remove a board member from an independent agency, and just a general read of it, you can assume that lawsuits are expected based on the termination, since it does not appear that she would meet one of those 3 criteria on there. This is one of the outsized roles in the federal government no one ever hears about. The National Labor Relations Board General Counsel is even more powerful than board members of the NLRB. So this is something to watch very closely. He has denied now the NLRB a quorum, which means it cannot move forward as an independent agency and put forward new proposals and new decisions and rulemakings. In addition, because there's no GC, they also can't issue interpretations and opinion letters, which are even more encumbersome on some of our folks that go before that as well. Similarly to what he did at the NLRB, he did also remove 2 individuals from the EEOC. And those were not GCs, but they were commissioners at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He removed those both as well this week and appointed a new chair, still lacking a quorum. We'll see for how long that continues to go. And there might be instances in which he just does not want it to have a quorum and just lets the agency set as it is. So these are other areas that we do expect to see lawsuits filed, likely within the next few weeks, if they have not already been filed as of today. Now we're going to jump into a lot of these, and as we keep in mind where we are, it's still important to recognize that the president can make many directives, but he does need individuals to fill out and take through his orders that he puts forward. The executive orders and actions, we got a flurry of them. On day 1, President Trump issued 26 executive orders. That exceeds by far the 9 that were issued on day 1 by former President Biden, and of course exceeds the 1 issued on his first day in office in 2017. The 26 that he went through are quite extensive. He also went and added quite a bit more this week, obviously related to DEI, related to the military, now one related to the aviation after January 30th, and we see a few others. So we're not going to run through all of them, especially as they're not all directly related to the issues on which we lobby properly and we work, but we do know that he's certainly going quickly to make his imprint. It is also important to note the distinction between an executive order and a presidential action that is taken. One is a little bit more binding than the other, and the actions tend to be more directing agencies to take certain steps, less than the force of law than they have everywhere else. And obviously, as we've seen, he's established the Department of Government Efficiency that is now solely run by Elon Musk out of the EEOB over right next door to the White House. From our engagement with these folks, it's typically been more through the Congress as we're getting more of getting some serious ideas and concepts over to the lawmakers so they can flesh it out. Our concern is anything that's done by the agencies and by the Department of Government Efficiency in its own context could not have ultimately the force of law and could be easily undone. And so there's a lot that those folks, I think, still have to go through to learn the processes that are there. A few other things, obviously, as expected, he did declare a national energy emergency on day one, and he grants emergency approvals to facilitate the identification, leasing, siting, and production, transportation, refining, and generation of domestic energy resources, and of course on federal land, along with the Outer Continental Shelf as well. So this is another area of quick actions. Many things should not be a surprise to a lot of folks on either side of the aisle, since he's mentioned that he was going to do many of these issues on day one, whether it's securing our borders, dealing with some citizenship issues. Obviously, much of these will be challenged in the courts when we go through them. We're going to go in a couple slides here, a little bit more detail on those that are a bit more relevant to manufacturing and for business, but we did want to also flag that as part of the energy agenda, they are doing a review of, again, across the board, all of the above. And note, just with many executive orders, as in the past, a new executive order often undoes a previous one. So as you see the words here, revokes, that's typical. And we've got even some executive orders that go back to Harry Truman that continue to be revoked and reinstated depending on the political party. We, of course, as expected, has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, although that technically will take 12 months, along with that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that will take some time, but he can certainly undermine some of the other processes that are out there. And as we cautioned in 2017, just because the federal government is backing off on something, it does not mean that the states and the counties and other municipalities will back off themselves. More specific to our issues here, on the regulatory freeze pending review that I indicated, this was one of the actions that he had put out on the first day in office on January 20th. This has broad implications for broad rulemaking. What he says is that the agencies and the departments may not propose any rules until a department head or agency that's been designated or nominated by President Trump. The way it's written is you have to have been nominated or designated after January 20th at 12:01 p.m. That automatically precludes anybody from the previous administration being able to put forth any other actions or any orders that have not been signed off. You can get a waiver and you can request from the White House to move forward as an agency within that 60-day period. In certain circumstances, we've already seen that in some cases, but for the most part, we do see them as they have their nominees appointed is when we increasingly expect to see some of the rulemaking and reversals of previous regulations to start to come forward and interpretations. But we did also see the immediate withdrawal of any rules that have been sent to the Office of Federal Register but not published in the actual Federal Register. This is also important when we look at it. The Federal Register is the public document that has to carry all actions by the executive branch. And if they're not published there, they more likely or not don't have the force and rule of enforcement. And that's why it's important that he's blocked all actions there for anything pending. So how does this affect you? You're all in our members. We look at the OSHA heat rule for indoor and outdoor rule, for example. That is one of those that is pending. There are multiple rules that are out there that are pending that now the president has said they can stop because he can halt them from moving forward and potentially issue a new interpretation for those actions by those agencies to fit more in line with his vision for the regulatory agencies. He also does call for the considering for postponing for 60 days the effective date for any rules that have already been published. And this is also significant because on the way out, the former president and the administration did put forward other rules that were slated to start taking effect in the coming months. And this order would provide the authority to agencies to further delay those on his own. The Unleashing American Energy Executive Order, those are as well out there, and those go back to the Outer Continental Shelf, but more significant, this one was quite long. The regulatory freeze action and directive to the agencies was not quite extensive. It did reverse a number of EOs for Biden, but for the most part, it does what what it calls in the title. It's a regulatory freeze. Whereas on the Unleashing American Energy executive order is more of a directive to the agencies and departments to begin action now, to encourage additional energy explorations, to eliminate a number of provisions that they felt were describing as an electric vehicle mandate and discriminated against any other types of vehicles. So for the ICE, for the internal combustion engines, in this EO, he does specifically state that you cannot favor one technology or another, which is what most here in town describe as the electric vehicle mandate, because it says that you can't use certain technologies, and that's how they end up getting around that as well here. They do have a couple of reports and they look forward, but our expectation, and the folks over at Bracewell are really experts with their energy and environment department there. They're going to be able to put out some good material here in the coming weeks, we suspect. But watch this space here in the month of February in particular, now that we've got Lee Zeldin from the EPA going to be in place here pretty quick, and we expect to see some additional action in this space. And now we also have a Department of Energy, Department of Interior secretaries that are going to be in office, and we do anticipate quite a bit of flood on the energy side, along with that's a big priority in the reconciliation bill. We did want to spend a little bit of time here on the America First trade policy. Obviously, this is the one that's receiving the most attention, and we're going to go through about 7 or 8 slides here on some of those priorities on the America First trade policy. This is not an executive order. This is a presidential action where he's directing his agencies to take a number of steps. And what we're seeing is, okay, I've got Bloomberg breaking news. Trump tariffs on Canada, Mexico to begin on March 1 is a report. Okay, so we'll get to that in a few slides, but that's really what we're all dealing with. What we mentioned at the onset here is the president's trying to buy himself a little bit more time and put trading partners and domestic industry on notice, and that's exactly what he has been doing. In the American First Trade Policy presidential action put out on January 20th, the agencies must review and report back the recommendations to the White House in all cases except for one by April 1st. So if you are looking for more definitive timelines, that is written, and that is what is expected of all agencies. And I'd note that it says by April 1st. I would not be sitting and waiting till March 31st for some of these. The president's clearly in a hurry to move more quickly on some of these policy priorities that's out there. He's already said that he wants to review the effectiveness of the steel and aluminum exclusions, to review the possible expansion of Section 232 national security tariffs was also listed in there. Please recall that the national security tariffs, that is what is used to impose the 25% on steel and 10% on imported aluminum coming in from our allies and the rest of the world. So they are looking at ways to potentially expand those 232 national security tariffs to go beyond the materials. Rumor that I picked up earlier this week is they're examining areas outside of Chapters 72 and 73 in the Harmonized Tariff Schedule Code specifically to potentially include under national security. So trying to chase that down a little bit, and hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit more information on where they're going on that. This is significant, and this is part of what's happening right now with the President of Canada and Mexico, is that he directs the U.S. Trade Representative to begin the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement public consultation process soon, meaning now. He directs them to open it. This is critical because under the law, the USMCA, the new NAFTA, wasn't scheduled to come up under review until July 1st of 2026. This expedited process has quite a bit loaded into it, and why he wants to do it. The importance is he's trying to push Canadians and Mexicans to the table right now, and Canada obviously doesn't have a leader to even come to the table to negotiate with the president on these issues. In addition, he wants to investigate have USTR investigate Chinese discriminatory practices, look at the 301 actions that were taken by the previous president, the exclusions that were granted there. They are specifically asking to look into transnational subsidies, currency manipulation. All of these reports have to come from either Treasury, USTR, or Commerce by April 1st. And why these are important to lay out here: every one of these bullet points could lead to additional duties or tariffs that the president imposes. Some of the process, and we've covered this in the past, the president has to legally go through a process. Otherwise, the courts will step in and nullify the tariffs that he put in place. So, in certain areas, he has to declare a national emergency that will allow him to take actions and impose sanctions on movement of goods, products, or property. And then he can also launch an investigation under Section 122, 232, 301, 201 that would then allow him to impose a safeguard or other measure under the law following a public input period, or he can do an expedited, which he's likely doing right now on China over the next couple months, and also now on Canada and on Mexico. So that's why these bullets are important as they are, because they all indicate a different action that the president is anticipating that he wants to take in the coming weeks and not more than months as they go here. A few things on the negotiating side. He has indicated, at least we're hearing, that the United Kingdom and Kenya might get another round on potential free trade negotiations, but more likely they're going towards sectoral. That means they're going to look at different components with different industries to try to conduct free trade agreements with allies, not too dissimilar from the supply chain resiliency work that the Biden administration was doing, but a bit more formal than that. And then, of course, the zeroing issue, transnational subsidies, cost adjustments. Zeroing is a big issue on which we've been working for 20 some odd years now, that artificially inflates the duty margin that is applied to a product that is dumped here and shipped into the United States. So that's something that we will take great attention to. And the feasibility of the External Revenue Service. Of course, we've heard quite a bit about whether he can or cannot do. We've mentioned that on January 20th, he issued all of those America First trade policy orders that you saw in the previous slides. Didn't take him long. On January 24th, the U.S. Trade Representative announced that it was launching its compliance review of the Economic Trade Agreement. This is what we call the Phase 1 trade agreement that President Trump signed with the Chinese in January of 2020. That was the cooling down, so he would not increase the tariff rate from 25 to 50%, and that's how he brought the Chinese to the table to pledge to increase goods. COVID hit, the Chinese did not purchase those goods, and that's what this study is that he wants to have done by April 1st. And you can already again see how USTR moved pretty quickly. There is no U.S. Trade Representative. The Chief of Staff, from what I've been told, still isn't over there yet. But USTR recognizes that the president wants this move quickly, and therefore they've already launched two of these actions based on the presidential notice that came out on January 20th, including announcing the review of unfair foreign trade practices. This one certainly is going to lead to duties and tariffs and is very broad investigation that can cover allies and those that are not allied with us alike. And we can certainly expect that this will ultimately result in one of the tariff actions under the different trade rules that he's got. Some of these, and we'll give some color into tariffs here in a minute. I'm going to ask Caitlin to jump in a few slides as well in terms of where we think things are going on Canada and Mexico. But again, they are not slowing down in this process now with just a few days into the administration. We have also seen, as we mentioned on that first slide on the America First, or the second, how the president directed the agency, the Commerce Department, to start looking at the Section 232 exclusion review process. They've already started today, Friday, this morning. They did post in the Federal Register. Again, that's the medium where they have to put all the government documents for the feds. And that says today that they want them to conduct an investigation or a review with public comment on the information collection forms that are for the exclusion. So when one of our members would file a request with the Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security, to not have to pay the 232 tariffs on imported steel or aluminum, you have to fill out a form. They're looking at making changes on this, and that's for the exclusion process. We will, again, as we have in the past, on our own and or through the Coalition for American Manufacturers and Users that the Bracewell team runs, file comments with the Commerce Department as well. I did notice that they also did request some input on the objection form. This is the form that the steel industry uses to oppose any request from you all for tariff relief on an imported steel or aluminum item that's not made here in the United States sufficiently or in quantity that you need it. And so those are areas to try to take a look at where they go. But Caitlin, part of the back and forth is, and I'll set it up like this, is obviously he's negotiating through the media right now with the Canadians and Mexicans, but we've been talking here, at least among trade lobbyists and Hill staff and others around the administration, is the president views tariffs in different tiers. Some of them he views as part of good policy for manufacturing and should be a baseline for industrial policy. Others he sees as punitive to punish different allies and non-allies for their behavior. And then other tariffs, Caitlin, such as the ones that he's now talking about on Canada and Mexico, might be just to bring them to the table.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he sees tariffs as a critical part of his foreign policy strategy. I mean, we could have predicted some of this when he did an interview while he was still running for office for the second time and said that the word tariff was his favorite word, the most beautiful word, right? So I think some of this is predictable in that way. But so what are you looking at on the screen? You're looking at a number of headlines from media outlets where you're seeing sort of the back and forth negotiations playing out in media. This is important for you all because we are getting tons of inquiries from reporters, domestic and international, top line national publications as well as regional publications about what tariffs might mean for the manufacturing industry. Thanks very much to members who have already participated in interviews. And we certainly have many more opportunities for people who may want to volunteer to speak to media. We obviously would equip you for those conversations and make sure that you feel well prepared to have those conversations if it's something that is interesting to you to be a part of that discussion. It's interesting, Omar, what you were saying about you see this playing out in the media. When you deal with the Trump administration, media is something of a double-edged sword. It can get attention, but it can also spark backlash from the administration. So we are cautious in our approach to media, as I think many other organizations and certainly companies are right now. But there is an opportunity to weigh in on the implications of these policy issues. And we'll certainly keep the group apprised as to those opportunities as they become available.
Yeah, and this is rapidly moving and evolving, and it's not just going to be today, this weekend, March 1st. This is going to continue. And the message that I received from Republicans on the Hill yesterday that are close to the administration is, I don't think people realize how serious Trump is about just leaving NAFTA, leaving the USMCA, that if he's not going to get what he wants out of Canada and Mexico, the message I received very directly yesterday was, he is a lot more serious about this than people realize that he is. So that question just came in. Will potential tariffs on Canada and Mexico face challenges due to violating USMCA? Can any of those challenges delay implementation? So I'm going to give you a slightly Washington answer, and the answer is both yes and no. You can challenge the tariffs. They are a violation of the US Mexico Canada agreement that President Trump negotiated and wrote in the first administration. However, it doesn't go to a US court. It doesn't go to a court for arbitration. There isn't going to be a judge that says, United States, that you lose and then it's enforceable. It would go to a panel that is part of NAFTA, the USMCA inter-party dispute panel. It's a process where you would file a formal complaint. You would have a certain number of days, it's 60 or 90, to start talking, and then you could start filing different cases. There is a very specific and spelled out process that prevent exactly what the president is trying to do. There is then an exact process for how the president could, in fact, go about taking the steps that he wants on USMCA. However, that does not seem to be an issue of concern for this administration because the repercussions are through a dispute resolution panel that is of their own creation. And there are no monetary penalties all it would ultimately do is allow Canada or Mexico to retaliate with their own tariffs, which they frankly are already in the process of doing. We are past, I saw on their website that the President Sheinbaum was going to hold a press conference at 10:30 Mexico City time today, and she was going to start addressing the retaliatory list. I'm not sure if she's going to hold off on that based on now the March 1 delay, but I'm trying to answer that question that was asked as straight as I can because you shouldn't think of it as going to a court in arbitration as you would with a customer. This is going to, or even to the World Trade Organization, which is not enforceable. It's going to, if it does, go to a NAFTA dispute panel at USMCA, and then it'll end up dying there. So yes, the president can do this because there really aren't as many repercussions that would stop him from doing that. There's no legal pathway for him to do it. He's just going to do it, which tends to be a trend. A few other things we now jump into regulations. Again, we're going to try to wrap you up and get you out of here in the next 6 or 7 minutes. Please do type in any other questions related to trade taxes or any other points. Obviously, this is very fluid. We hope to have a little bit more concrete answers coming up the next few days and a few weeks on some of these actions. We did want to put some things that we do know on the regulatory side. The Corporate Transparency Act injunction remains in place. We conducted a survey recently of NTMA and PMA, and roughly 40% of our members are subject to the corporate transparency beneficial ownership information that's required by law under a law that took effect starting in 2020 and 2021. What that law says is that for all companies with fewer than 20 employees with 20 or fewer employees and 5 million or less in gross receipts, then you must file beneficial ownership information with the federal government with a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, that includes and details the contact information, emails, phone numbers, picture ID, copy of the driver's license, etc. That is on hold right now. The Supreme Court did, however, say that they could move forward collecting that information, but that was only in one of 2 cases moving through the federal circuit. There is another case also in Texas at the same time that still has a nationwide injunction in place. You will see that notification here, acknowledged by the federal government that you do not, in a separate nationwide order that's issued by a different federal judge in Texas. There is going to go before a court hearing, and that's going to be on March 25th is going to be the next court case for the other one that was on the other in the Texas Top Cop Shop. That one's going before the courts on March 25th. So you do not need to file your beneficial ownership for entities that were in creation prior to January 1 of 2024. OSHA did release, as they do every January, their 2025 civil penalties. This is their latest maximum minimum accounts for civil penalties that they adjust for inflation, and they put out every year. You'll see the serious violations that go on there. The willful and repeat, it's still to be seen what the President Trump does on the recent updates and the increase on the willful and repeat violations, the increase that the Biden administration did. So there potentially could be some changes on a few of these where we see that willful and repeated number getting up there at the maximum penalty of $165,514 per violation, and adding on some of the criminal. And we're waiting to see what can happen based on the gravity-based penalties in there under the new administration and how those will be. Please note that these are in effect and assessed after January 15th of 2025, unless some additional steps are taken by OSHA between now and then. As I briefly mentioned on the OSHA heat rules, we get ready to wrap up in a few slides. The OSHA heat rule, we did have 17,792 comments, of which we did file our own as well. The next steps in this is, of course, going to be subject to review by the incoming Trump administration. We do not expect they're going to move forward with the proposed rule as is, but we do have a couple of trigger points coming up in April when the National Emphasis Program expires, and also in June when we've got a public hearing that they scheduled to go out there as well. A few other area. EPA, OSHA have signed a memorandum of understanding to implement some TSCA enforcement areas. This is critical, especially for the trichloroethylene that the EPA is trying to eliminate. There is an action in Capitol Hill to try to block that, on which we are working, but know that the MOU here means that they're going to be fully in alignment in how they develop outreach materials to the regulated community, which is you all, in their effort to try to eliminate and try to minimize some of the TSCA violations that are out there and some of the filings and additional enforcement. And ultimately, if this were a Democratic administration, this would be tied into the DOJ as well to increase their enforcement, as the DOJ has done elsewhere. No, you're not intended necessarily to be able to read what's on the right. Our California friends, please note you have a whistleblower rights notice that is now in effect as of January 1, 2025, and is the one of our California regulators. They are very prescriptive of how your signage and what your notifications must look like, 14-point typeface. We put this up here for our non-Californians as well, so you can take a look at what is to come. We've had quite a bit going on. You Michiganders, February 21st, that's a big day for your paid sick leave. For some of the other states as well. Illinois has got a few other rules. Massachusetts got one coming up. Take a look at some of these in your state, an example of not to lose track of your locals as well. IRS tax filing season is open. That happens this time of year every year. And then the last few slides on just some data and what we're seeing in the marketplace with a few other changes that are out there. The the PCE numbers, personal consumption and expenditures numbers came out at 8:30 Eastern this morning. This is a quick preview of what you'll see, a 0.4% increase in the monthly income rate for personal income that's out there. And then on the actual inflation side, you are seeing a 2.6% increase in a 1 month year over year on the PCE increase, which is closer to where they want it to go, but extracting the food and energy side, that's a little bit higher at the 2.8, a little obviously above where they want at the 2% target. Back on the trade side, some numbers are put in the context. The discussions over Mexico and Canada here on the trade activity, just to help you visualize the significant amount that you're looking at, in that it is pretty much 30% of all trade that United States does is with Canada and Mexico. And that you'll see that any disruptions you're going to be hearing from your customers, suspect, over the next few weeks. But the best news that frankly we just got is, if in fact it's not happening on February 1st, that does provide a little bit more time for the markets to settle down. And we do know the Commerce Secretary is having his confirmation hearing, I believe it's next week, and we should have the USTR is now scheduled for February 6th, I just heard as well, to get him over there on that front. U.S. In EU export-import trade activity, obviously that's quite significant and is only trending up, shows you more of what's at stake. And then one last one for the way out on the Biden administration, what they put forward on, and this one did also reference tooling in one of their reports that they put out, but it did have quite a bit of focus on non-market policies, which is a code word and code phrase for China in that context. We'll see. There's some decent things in there that we could expect that the Trump administration will pick up on moving forward from there. And lastly, we do have what's still ongoing, the lawsuits filed over U.S. Nippon Steel deal. We do know that those two have filed suits for wrongful involvement and interference. We have also heard about Nucor potentially wanting to buy certain parts and maybe a deal for Cleveland Cliffs to buy some others. That is a fluid situation as well. We believe the Commerce Secretary and Department will likely take the lead as this issue continues to fester here in Washington, D.C. As always, please, you can stay connected. Listen to us through the One Voice podcast. We had our podcast just recently post just about a week ago or so. And as always, that's a good way to get more of a political analysis of what's going on. The latest here from DC, no shortage of topics. We'll be recording one in the next week or so. And as always, please do donate to the NTMA and PMA to support the advocacy efforts that we've got ongoing here in DC with the Bracewell side and what we're doing for you up on the Hill and with the administration. Happy to answer any questions and sit online for a little bit longer. Please do type in your questions into the Q&A box over there it might be the right-hand side or up above, and try to answer them to the best that we can. Again, on the trade, we try not to work in speculation, more on informed speculation to the extent that we can, just trying to relay to you what we've heard over the last few hours from here in DC on the Hill. Any questions on anything, taxes, regulatory, trade? You can certainly expect real-time updates from us over the coming weeks and your coming days as well. We did have a question come in with regard to the rescission of Section 174. That's the research and development requirement to amortize over 5 years and capitalize an asset, your R&D activities. The conversations that I had yesterday on the Hill, so I do not believe the question was, are you going to get retroactivity to 2022 for R&D activity expensing? Because as of January 1, 2022, you no longer can fully expense your R&D activities. You have to amortize over 5 years and capitalize those. And the short answer is, I do not believe so. I do not believe we are going to be made whole going back to 2022 and 2023 for R&D. Right now, it's a stretch to get 2024 made whole. The conversation is more likely going to be centered on a January 1, 2025 start date for R&D expensing and also for bonus depreciation at 100%. But even at that, it is not entirely clear that that would be the case, as the legislation that was just introduced to double the Section 179, that has a start date of January 1 of 2026 to minimize the overall score. So in a scenario, we could see much of this beginning on January 1 of 2026. That's what we were fighting to prevent. We were fighting to hold 2025 January 1 for both R&D to remove the amortization and also for the 100% restoring of expensing. But we certainly are asking for 2024. Just I don't want to tell you the door is closed on 22 and 23, but it is extremely, extremely difficult to go back to that based on conversations that we've had on the Hill over the last day and more importantly over the last few months even. Any other questions that have come in? And that certainly will keep you, again, we're on the Hill every week, talking to folks every week on this. I know the Bracewell, their lobby shop is doing some of the same. They've got a great tax team and business communities working hard on trying to get these retroactive. But that's, as we've always cautioned, it gets harder and harder to do the further away you get from those trigger dates. Any other questions? Appreciate your patience. We ran long. We expected to do so with this first time with the president, and we might even have to do so next time if we get more information. As always, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we're happy to provide any more information, answer any questions that you've got. In the interim, please look out for our Washington Wire. We did just send one out this week, and we should be posting a podcast shortly. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll be back next month.